All right, welcome back to week 5. You have officially finished 25% of the course, and we've made it this far. This means you only have 75% of the course left. So it's incredibly important that we stay on top of things like work as we move through the course. Today we're going to talk about the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade. We're kind of talking about the time period from 900 to 1860. So as you move through these lectures and the module this week, there are some focus questions that can really help you stay on track and better understand what exactly I'm looking for with things. So what was the Middle Passage? What happened to Africans after they crossed the Atlantic? How were slaves treated in the Americas? And why did the Atlantic slave trade end? Now, I did include some timelines on your slides that basically trace the history of slavery from 900 to 1860 in a very rough way. Keep in mind this is American slavery, and the slaves who come to reside in the United States are the slaves that we are specifically talking about in that timeline. Now, the Middle Passage is essentially the middle leg of the journey. What happens is the journey begins in England or North America. Then the journey travels to West Africa. Now then so that is the first leg of the journey. That second leg of the journey is from West Africa to the Americas, or wherever the slaves are going to end up, whether it be, it is the Americas, but it may not be the United States, right? It could be the Spice Islands or another part of the Americas in that journey. But that is the Middle Passage, that journey from Africa to where an individual was enslaved. Then the final journey is from after they have unloaded their human cargo to go pick up supplies, to turn around and do it all over again. And it basically is this triangle, right? So in the early 18th century, we see slavers. Now, slavers are European ships carrying slaves crossing the Atlantic Ocean. During this time, this becomes known as the Middle Passage. This is coined by the British to designate a name for this middle leg of the triangular journey. The Middle Passage today denotes a journey into unimaginable pain, cruelty, and widespread suffering. Essentially, when we talk about the Middle Passage, we're talking about hell on earth, like a really awful environment and condition. Now, the growth of the Atlantic slave trade is important to talk about. Slaves were imported to different countries between the years approximately 1451 until 1870 in this realm of slavery. We're not talking about slavery for all times. We're literally just talking about the triangular slave trade route and the Middle Passage. What comes to transpire is that about 500,000 slaves or humans will be imported to British North America. Spanish America will receive about 2.5 million humans. British Caribbean, 2 million. West Africans. All of these are West Africans, right, that are slaves imported in this slave trade. That's important to designate to you so that you understand what group we're talking about, right? The French Caribbean sees about 1.6 million slaves. The Dutch Caribbean, about 500,000 slaves. And then the Danish Caribbean only receives about 28,000 slaves. Brazil receives 4 million slaves. And then about 200,000 slaves will return to the Old World or Europe. Now, the growth of the American slave trade will happen. One of the things that is completely unique about the Americas when we're talking about the enslavement of humans is that slavery becomes based on race. Now, most slaves who are traded in the Americas or taken to the Americas in the beginning are men. This is because they want agricultural labor, and rarely do they want any type of domestic servant or soldiers. Occasionally, these slaves will see those roles, but it's pretty rare. Now, the slave trade will be dominated by Portugal and Spain during the 16th century, and during that time, we see a huge growth of slave, and essentially, we're going to see a monopoly established over the trade, which then will grant charters to private companies, and these private companies are the only people who are allowed to go to West Africa and obtain human chattel or slaves. Now, the profits from this are incredibly large. So pretty soon, the Dutch, the French, and the English are like, whoa, maybe Portugal and Spain are onto something. We want to make money too. So with hopes of great profit, they began their own involvement into the triangular slave trade. So in the early 17th century, the Dutch will drive the Portuguese from the West African coast, and that is when essentially the Dutch will take over the slave trade, and really the Dutch kind of control it pretty much from there on out. So in the 1620s in Maryland and Virginia, tobacco is going to become incredibly important, and as tobacco becomes important in the Chesapeake, it's going to be incredibly we need to remember, as tobacco becomes prominent in the Chesapeake, that this whole system that's emerging is going to really take foot in what will become the United States. So after 1713, we will see a shift from the Dutch to England dominating the slave trade. This is because the Dutch start to get involved in other things and start to see the slave trade as maybe not the most profitable option. Now, the slave trade and the crops that the slaves farm obviously are incredibly profitable, and it makes a lot of people rich. So what we are going to see within that triangular trade slave trade system is that two separate systems emerge. The first is going to be from England to West Africa to the West Indies to England. And the traders will carry English goods to West Africa. The English goods will be exchanged for the slaves along with some African goods. And then the traders will take the slaves to the West Indies. In the West Indies, they get sugar. Then they take that sugar back to England. That is the slave trade. Now, the second triangular slave trade that emerges is from the New England colonies to West Africa, to the West Indies, back to the New England colonies. White Americans who are from England in the New England colonies really like rum. West Africans also really like rum. So essentially, they're going to ship rum down to the West Africans. The rum will be traded for the slaves, and then the slaves will be taken to the West Indies, where they'll be exchanged for sugar or molasses, and the sugar or molasses will be taken back to New England, which allows New England to continue to distill their rum. That's kind of what it is based on there. Now, we're going to return to talk about some of the awful and horrendous things that are going to happen to these West Africans as they're captured and enslaved.